Margaret Ellis didn't knock. She couldn't. Her hands were shaking too hard, her knees already buckled against the dirt, and the letter, the one that had ended her life in 4 brutal sentences, was still crumpled in her fist when the gate swung open and a stranger stared down at her. She hadn't even heard him coming. She only knew she was kneeling in the dust outside a ranch she'd never seen before, with nowhere left to go. And a man she'd never met was the only thing standing between her and the Montana night. If this story moves your heart, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very last word, because this story is far from over. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this tale has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. The letter was 4 sentences long. Margaret had read it 11 times since the wagon dropped her at the edge of Harlan Creek, which wasn't much of a town, a general store, a church with a broken weather vane, a saloon that smelled like regret, and about 40 people who had nothing better to do on a Tuesday afternoon than watch a stranger fall apart in the middle of their only street. She hadn't fallen apart. That was the thing. She had stood perfectly still in the dust while the wagon driver handed down her single trunk, tipped his hat without meeting her eyes, and clicked his horses forward like he couldn't get away fast enough. She had stood there holding her traveling bag against her chest, while the letter from Mr. Gerald Holt, the man who had written her 17 letters over 8 months, who had called her a woman of remarkable character, who had sent her train fare and told her Montana needed women with good sense and strong hearts, while that letter sat folded in her gloved hand like a piece of garbage she hadn't found a bin for yet. She read it one more time. Not because she didn't know what it said, because some part of her still couldn't believe a man could write something so small. Miss Ellis, I regret to inform you that upon reflection, I find I am unable to proceed with our arrangement. You are not the woman I envisioned. I wish you safe travels back to Pennsylvania. G. Holt. That was it. No apology. No explanation beyond those 7 words. Not the woman I envisioned, which everyone in Harlan Creek seemed to understand perfectly well without being told, because not one of them stepped forward. Not one of them offered water or shade or a chair. They looked at her the way people look at a horse that's already been put down, with a kind of detached sadness that costs them nothing. A woman near the general store whispered something to her companion. Both of them glanced at Margaret's waist and then looked away. A man on the saloon porch said loudly enough to carry, "Holt always did have more hope than sense." Margaret's jaw tightened. She folded the letter a 12th time and pressed it into her bag. She was 25 years old. She had crossed 11 states and more than 1,800 miles. She had left behind every person she had ever known, every street she had ever walked, every familiar sound and smell, because Gerald Holt had written her 17 letters and told her she was exactly what he was looking for. She had believed him because she was practical, not romantic. She had read his letters 3 times each, looking for dishonesty and finding none. She had weighed the risk the way she weighed every decision, carefully and without sentiment. She had decided this was real. She was wrong. The afternoon sun was still burning hot, and Margaret was standing in it with her trunk and her bag and the remains of her dignity, and not a single soul in Harlan Creek was going to help her. She picked up her trunk herself. She was strong. People had always been surprised by that. Surprised that a woman built the way she was built could lift and carry and work without complaint. As if her size were a sentence and not simply a fact. As if the body that had carried her 25 years without failing her once were somehow evidence of weakness. She asked the woman near the general store where the nearest ranch was. The woman looked at her like she'd asked where to find the moon. "You're not planning to walk," the woman said. "I'm planning to find shelter before dark," Margaret said. "The ranch. Which direction?" The woman pointed west. "Carter Place is about 2 miles, but William Carter doesn't take visitors." "Does he take paying boarders?" "He doesn't take anybody." "Thank you," Margaret said, and started walking. She heard laughter behind her. She didn't turn around. 2 miles with a trunk and a traveling bag in Montana. Summer heat was not a small thing. She stopped twice, once to rest her arms, once to let a snake cross the road ahead of her at its own pace, because she wasn't in the business of rushing anything that could kill her. Her boots raised dust with every step. The land was wide and silent and indifferent in a way she found almost comforting compared to the crowd she'd just left behind. She thought about her sister Clara back in Philadelphia, who had begged her not to go. "You don't know this man, Maggie. You don't know anything about Montana." Margaret had smiled and said she knew enough, and Clara had cried, and Margaret had not cried, because she was the kind of person who saved her tears for situations that actually warranted them. This was getting close. She could see the ranch gate when the wagon wheel cracked. It wasn't her wagon. It was a small freight wagon coming from the opposite direction that had pulled off the road, not 50 yards ahead of her. And when Margaret got close enough, she could see that the rear axle had snapped clean through. The driver, a boy of maybe 16, was standing in the road staring at it like looking hard enough might fix it. "You got anyone coming for you?" Margaret asked. The boy shook his head. "My pa's in town. I was supposed to be back by supper." "What are you carrying?" "Feed. For Carter's horses." Margaret looked at the gate, which was perhaps 200 yards further. She looked at the broken wagon. She looked at the boy. "Help me get my trunk to that gate," she said, "and I'll sit with your wagon until someone comes. Nobody's going to steal horse feed in daylight, but you shouldn't leave it unattended." The boy blinked. "You're going to Carter's." "I'm going to try. He don't like people much. I've noticed that's a theme in this county," she said. "Are you going to help me or not?" He helped her. Which was how Margaret ended up standing at William Carter's gate, with her trunk, her bag, and a boy named Tommy Briggs, who had appointed himself her temporary escort. Both of them looking at the ranch house in the fading afternoon light when the door opened and a man came out. She registered tall, wide shoulders. A face that had spent years in sun and weather settled now into something that wasn't quite a scowl, but wasn't far from it. He moved like a man who was used to covering ground without wasting effort. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and he had a rifle across his back that he wasn't reaching for, which she took as a reasonable sign. He stopped at the gate and looked at her. Then he looked at Tommy. "Your wagon break down again," he said to the boy. "Yes, sir, Mr. Carter. Axle this time." William Carter looked back at Margaret. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in it. A slight narrowing and adjustment. The way a man looks when he's trying to work out a problem, and the problem is looking back at him. "Who are you?" he said. "Margaret Ellis," she said. "I was supposed to marry Gerald Holt today. He changed his mind." A beat of silence. "Changed his mind," William repeated. "He left a letter. I have it if you'd like to read it, though I'd warn you, it reflects poorly on his character, and not particularly well on yours as a species." She paused. "No offense." Something moved through his eyes. Not quite amusement. Not quite pity. Something in between that she couldn't name. "Where are you from?" he said. "Pennsylvania, Philadelphia." "You walked from town with that trunk?" "I did." He looked at the trunk. He looked at her. He looked at Tommy, who was watching all of this with the focused attention of a boy storing up a story for later. "Tommy," William said, "go flag down someone on the road and get your wagon sorted. Leave the feed by the gate, I'll bring it in." "Yes, sir." Tommy looked at Margaret. "Good luck, ma'am." He said it earnestly without irony, which Margaret appreciated. She and William looked at each other through the gate. "I'm not looking for charity," she said. "I have money enough for a few nights' board, and I can work for whatever I can't cover. I need time to send a telegram to my sister and arrange transport back east. A week, maybe less. And if I say no, then I'll sleep under that tree," she said, nodding at a cottonwood 20 yards off the road, "and try again in the morning, and you'll have a Pennsylvanian on your property regardless, so you might as well have a useful one." He stared at her for a long moment. She stared back. She was too tired to be afraid, and too stubborn to look away first. William Carter unlatched the gate. "You can stay until you figure out where you belong," he said. "Supper's in an hour. Don't touch anything in the barn." "I wouldn't dream of it," Margaret said. She picked up her trunk and walked through. He didn't offer to take it from her. She didn't ask him to. She would think about that later, about how it was the first honest exchange she'd had all day. He hadn't pretended the situation was fine. He hadn't offered sympathy she didn't want. He'd stated a condition and opened the door and let her decide. There was something in that plain, unadorned offer that felt more like respect than anything Gerald Holt had written in 17 letters. But that came later. That night, she sat at William Carter's kitchen table and ate salt pork and cornbread in near total silence, and she did not cry, and she did not explain herself. And when he pointed her toward the small room off the kitchen that had a cot and a wash basin, she said, "Thank you," and went in and shut the door. She sat on the edge of the cot in the dark. She allowed herself exactly 10 minutes. Then she folded her grief back up, put it somewhere she could find it later, and started thinking about what she was going to do next. She didn't know that first night that there would come a morning when leaving would feel like the wrong direction. She didn't know the land outside that window would start to feel like something other than a problem. She didn't know that the quiet man who'd opened his gate without being asked to was carrying a wound just as old as hers, and that the particular silence of two people who've stopped expecting kindness can sometimes be the beginning of something that neither one of them has a name for yet. She didn't know any of that. She just sat in the dark and breathed, and started making plans. Margaret was a planner. It was the thing people misunderstood about her. Most often they looked at her and saw what they wanted to see, which was usually something soft, something that could be moved aside, something that could be managed. They did not see the woman who had run the supply records for Hargrove Shipping for 4 years, who had reorganized their entire inventory system in a month and a half, who had once talked a furious creditor down from the edge of a lawsuit by laying out 6 months of documentation on a conference table and walking him through it line by line until he ran out of arguments. They saw what she looked like. They didn't see what she did. Gerald Holt's letter was still in her bag. She thought about burning it. She decided to keep it instead because she was also the kind of woman who kept evidence. In the morning, she woke before the sun. She had slept badly on the narrow cot, which was not a complaint, but a fact, and she lay in the gray half-dark and listened to the sounds of the ranch. The horses moving in the barn, the wind coming off the mountains, and somewhere in the main room, the sound of William Carter's boots on the floor as he started his day without expecting anyone to share it. She got up, she dressed, she went into the kitchen. Howe was standing at the stove with his back to her, working at something that smelled like burned coffee, and when he heard her step, he turned and looked at her with the careful blankness of a man who has trained himself not to show surprise. "I didn't know you were awake," he said. "I've been awake for a while." She looked at the stove, at the pan, at the coffee. "That's going to be terrible." "It usually is." "Move," she said. He moved. He didn't argue about it, which she noted. There are men who argue about their kitchens the way they argue about their territory, and there are men who simply step aside when someone with a clear purpose walks toward a task. William Carter stepped aside. She found coffee that hadn't been scorched yet. She found eggs she'd noticed in the cold box the night before. She found a skillet that had been cleaned recently, which told her something about him. He was not a man who left messes to accumulate. She worked without speaking, and he sat at the table without speaking, and when she set a plate in front of him and poured 2 cups of coffee that were not burned, he looked at the food for a moment before he looked at her. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I told you I'd work for my board," she said, sitting across from him. "This is part of that." "I didn't mean cooking." "Neither did I." She picked up her cup. "What needs doing today?" He was quiet for a moment. She could see him trying to place her, trying to fit her into some category he already had and failing. "Fence line on the north pasture needs checking," he said finally. "Some of the posts have been shifting, and I've got records from the last 2 months that need organizing: land assessments, cattle tallies, cost ledgers. I've been doing it myself, but I'm behind." "Records," she said. "Is that a problem?" "No," she said. "That's my job, my previous job. I ran records and inventory for a shipping company in Philadelphia." He looked at her steadily. "You're telling me you came west to be a rancher's wife, and you left behind a career in supply management?" "I came west because I thought Gerald Holt was an honest man, and Montana sounded like a place where a person could be something new." She set down her cup. "I was wrong about one of those things." Something moved across his face. Not pity. Something more considered than that. "The records are in the front room," he said. I'll show you after breakfast. The ledgers were a disaster. Not because he was careless. She could see he wasn't. She could see he had a methodical mind that just didn't have the training for this kind of organization. The numbers were all there. The logic was there. But it was like watching a man try to build a cabinet with the right materials and the wrong tools, and everything was close, but nothing quite fit. She sat at his table for 2 hours that morning, while he was out checking the fence line, going through 3 months of records, and by the time he came back in for midday, she had a reorganized ledger, a list of 3 discrepancies that suggested he was being overcharged by his grain supplier, and a preliminary note about a section of his eastern acreage that didn't appear in any of his official land documentation. He stood in the doorway reading her notes for a long time. "This discrepancy with the grain," he said. "You're sure?" "I'm sure. You've been paying for weights that don't match your delivery receipts for at least 6 months. Either someone made a consistent error, or someone's been skimming." "Harlan Creek Feed and Supply," he said. The way he said it told her it wasn't a surprise exactly, but the confirmation landed heavy. "And this land section," she said. "The eastern quarter. It's not in your deed paperwork. That land's been part of this ranch since my father's time. It's always been understood." "Understanding isn't legal documentation," she said. "Not in my experience. You should have a surveyor out there before anyone else notices it's undocumented." He was quiet. Outside, a horse moved in the barn. "Where did you learn all this?" he said. 4 years working for a man who built his business from nothing," she said. "I watched every mistake he made and made sure it didn't happen twice. And he let you go when you decided to come west." "He didn't want to. I gave him 3 months' notice and trained my replacement." William sat down slowly across the table. He looked at the reorganized ledger. He looked at her. "Miss Ellis," he said, "I offered you a room until you figured out where you belonged. You did. I'm starting to think you might not be in the wrong place." She looked at him carefully. She had learned a long time ago to be careful with statements like that, because men said things like that when they were grateful, and gratitude was not the same as respect, and respect was not the same as seeing a person clearly. "That's kind of you," she said. "But I'd ask you to wait until you've known me longer before you form that opinion." He nodded. "Fair enough. And I'd like to look at that fence line tomorrow. You said the posts are shifting. What direction are they leaning?" "East mostly." "That could be water table movement. There might be moisture in the soil under that section that's affecting the ground pressure." She paused. "I read a great deal on the train." He looked at her again, that same careful adjusting look, like a man updating a map he thought he had finished. "You read about fence posts," he said. "I read about land management, agricultural systems, and frontier homesteading." A beat. The train was very long. The first thing that might have been a smile crossed his face. It wasn't much, just a slight shift at the corners of his mouth, but it was there, and she noticed it. "I'll take you out there in the morning," he said. She nodded. She gathered the ledger and her notes and carried them back to the front room shelf where they belonged, and she thought, standing there with her hands on the organized stack of papers, that this was not what she had planned. She had planned a week. She had planned a telegram and a train east and a return to something that looked like her old life, even if it never quite felt the same. She had not planned to find a ledger that needed her, or a fence line that needed examining, or a man who stepped aside in his own kitchen without making it into something. She had not planned any of this. But Margaret Ellis had also spent her whole life learning that plans were just the beginning of the negotiation, and the real work was always what you did when everything changed. She went back to the kitchen. She started thinking about what to make for supper. The days began to build on each other, the way days do when there's enough work to fill them. Margaret moved through the ranch with the same focused efficiency she had applied to everything in her life, and William Carter watched her with the careful attention of a man who has been surprised and is trying to figure out whether to trust the feeling. She learned the fence line. She learned the cattle rotation. She learned the names of his horses, 3 of them, Bay Smoke and a young gelding he hadn't named yet and seemed reluctant to, which she thought was either superstition or attachment, and she wasn't sure which was more interesting. She also learned Harlan Creek, not by going there willingly. She went to the general store on the fourth day because William needed supplies, and she offered to go in his place because he had a full day's work ahead of him, and she needed to send her telegram to Clara anyway. She walked in with her list, conducted her business efficiently, and was on her way back out when she overheard the woman behind the counter say to the man beside her, in a voice designed to carry exactly as far as it carried, "She's still out there at Carter's place. Lord knows what she's offering him to let her stay." Margaret stopped. She turned around slowly. The woman was maybe 50, with a tight mouth and eyes that slid sideways rather than meeting hers directly. "I'm offering him," Margaret said clearly. 4 years of supply management experience, a reorganized ledger, and considerably better coffee than he was making for himself. If that disappoints you, I apologize. She turned back to the door. "He won't keep you," the woman said. "A man like Carter doesn't keep women like you." Margaret turned around one more time. She looked at the woman, looked at her fully without flinching, without softening it. "That," she said, "is entirely between Mr. Carter and me. And I notice you've used the word keep twice now, as if I'm a stray animal rather than a person who is having a conversation. I'd ask you to correct that, but I suspect this is simply how you think, and that's a much longer project than I have time for today." She walked out. She was 3 steps down the street when she heard laughter from inside the store, not cruel laughter. More like the surprised, involuntary kind that happens when something lands harder than expected. She didn't look back. She walked back to the ranch. She delivered the supplies. She said nothing to William about what had happened. She thought she'd gotten away with it until that evening, when they were sitting in the front room after supper, her with the ledger, him with a map of the property he'd been trying to update, and he said without looking up, "I heard you had words with Ellen Marsh in town today." She kept her eyes on the ledger. "Who told you that?" "Tommy Briggs. He has a talent for being everywhere important things happen." "It was a brief exchange," she said. "Tommy said you left her without a comeback for the first time in 30 years. She looked up. He was watching her with that same almost smile he'd shown her in the kitchen. "She was rude," Margaret said. "She's rude to everyone. The difference is, most people don't answer." "I've spent 25 years not answering," Margaret said. "I'm tired of it." He held her look for a moment. "Good," he said quietly. "Just that. Just good." He looked back down at his map. She looked back down at the ledger. Neither of them said anything else, but something had shifted in the room. Some small, careful thing had moved from one side of a line to the other, and Margaret was aware of it, the way you're aware of a change in weather before you can say exactly what changed. She turned a page. She kept working. Outside, the Montana night came down with all its stars and silence, and the Carter Ranch sat quiet under it. And inside, 2 people who had spent their whole lives believing they were better off alone were slowly, carefully, without planning to proving themselves wrong. But that proof would cost them both before it was over, because Harlan Creek was watching, and a man named Charles Whitmore had just arrived in town on the afternoon stage, carrying a leather satchel full of documents and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. And he had been looking at William Carter's land for a long time. Charles Whitmore came to Harlan Creek. The way trouble always came to small towns, quietly with good manners and a clean suit and a smile that made people want to trust him before they had any reason to. He checked into the only boarding house in town on a Thursday evening, paid a full week in advance, and spent his first 2 days doing nothing more suspicious than asking polite questions. He asked about the land. He asked about water rights. He asked about which ranchers had been there longest and which ones were struggling. He did it all over coffee and card games with the easy confidence of a man who already knew the answers and was just confirming them. By Saturday, Tommy Briggs had told Margaret about the stranger in town. Tommy had a gift for appearing at moments of consequence, and Margaret had decided early on that this was less coincidence than intelligence. The boy missed nothing and said everything, which made him simultaneously the best and most dangerous source of information in the county. "He's from Helena," Tommy reported, sitting on the porch step while Margaret checked the supply log she'd been cross-referencing with William's delivery receipts. "Says he's a land assessor, but he's been talking to Judge Alderman privately, and nobody talks to aldermen privately unless they want something official done quiet." Margaret looked up from the ledger. Did anyone ask him what he's assessing? Mr. Hennessy at the saloon asked. The man smiled and said he was just doing routine surveys for the territorial government. And people believed that. Mr. Hennessy did. I didn't. Tommy picked up a piece of straw and chewed on it. He was asking specific questions about the Carter property, about the Eastern Quarter especially. Margaret went very still. "You're sure?" she said. He asked Hennessy if that section had ever been formally surveyed. Hennessy said he didn't know. The man wrote something down. She set down the ledger. She found William in the barn, with Smoke checking the horse's left foreleg, which had been favoring slightly for 2 days. She stood in the entrance and waited until he looked up. "Someone's asking about your Eastern Quarter in town," she said. "A man named Whitmore from Helena." William's hands went still on the horse's leg. "What kind of asking?" "Whether it's been formally surveyed. Whether the documentation is complete." She paused. "William, we talked about that section. You said the land's been part of this ranch since your father's time. What does the deed actually say?" He straightened up slowly. "The deed covers the main parcel. The eastern section was added under a homestead extension. My father filed the paperwork in '71. Filed it where? Territorial Land Office. In Helena." The word sat between them. "I need to see that extension filing," she said. "Not your copy. The original record. Do you have any correspondence from the land office confirming it was received and registered?" William looked at her for a long moment. She could see the thing happening in his face that happened when a man starts understanding something he didn't want to understand. "I don't know," he said. "My father handled all of it. When he died, I inherited the ranch and the papers he kept. I've never had cause to question the records." "That's exactly what someone was counting on," Margaret said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The quieter she got, the more serious she was, and he had learned that in 10 days. He closed the barn, and they went into the house, and for the next 2 hours, they went through every piece of paper his father had ever kept. Deeds, receipts, letters, land, correspondence, tax records. William sat across the table from her and handed her papers, and she sorted them, and read them, and stacked them, and read them again. He didn't interrupt. He didn't explain. He had figured out somewhere in the last 10 days that the best thing to do when Margaret Ellis was working was to get out of her way and let her work. She found the homestead extension application. She did not find the confirmation of registration. She sat with that fact for a moment. Then she set the application aside and kept looking. She went through everything twice. She looked in places that weren't obvious inside other envelopes tucked into the back pages of the ledger from 1871 folded behind a tax receipt from 1873. Nothing. "Your father filed the application," she said finally. "But I can't find evidence that the Territorial Land Office confirmed the registration. Which means one of two things. Either the confirmation was lost in the mail in a move in the years since he died, or the registration was never completed. Or someone removed it," William said. She looked at him. "From the land office," he said. "From the official record, not from here." She hadn't said that yet, but she'd been thinking it. "That would require someone with access to territorial records," she said carefully, "and a reason to want that land shown as unregistered." "The railroad," William said. "There have been rumors for 2 years about a northern rail line coming through the territory. If it goes where the surveys suggest, it runs directly across my eastern quarter." He paused. "That land would be worth 10 times what it is now." The kitchen was very quiet. "Tell me everything you know about Whitmore," Margaret said. She went to town the next morning without telling William where she was going or what she planned. She went to the land office first. Harlan Creek's satellite land office, which handled local filings and kept copies of territorial records. The man behind the counter was young, polite, and clearly surprised to see a woman walking in alone with a question about deed registration procedures. She was friendly. She was precise. She asked exactly the right number of questions and not one more. She learned that Charles Whitmore had indeed been there the previous afternoon, requesting to review the survey maps for the northeastern section of the county. She learned that he had the appropriate credentials from Helena. She also learned by watching the young clerk's face carefully while he was looking at his files, that he was nervous about something he hadn't said. She asked him directly, "Is there something about those survey maps that's unusual?" He looked at her. He looked at the door. He was maybe 22, with the kind of face that hadn't learned yet how to hide what it knew. "The map for the Carter Eastern Quarter was flagged last year," he said in a voice that was lower than it needed to be. "Someone submitted a question about its registration status. I wasn't here when it happened, I only know because the flag's in the file. But once a flag's in there, any inquiry about that land gets sent up to Helena automatically." "Who submitted the question?" "I don't know. It doesn't say in the file." "But someone knew to ask," Margaret said. "Someone knew to ask," he agreed. She thanked him and left. She was walking back down the main street when Charles Whitmore came out of the hotel directly in front of her, and they nearly collided. He stepped back. He tipped his hat. He was maybe 45, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and the careful grooming of a man who understood that appearance was argument. "I beg your pardon, ma'am," he said. He had a pleasant voice. Everything about him was pleasant, which Margaret had already decided was his primary tool. "Not at all," she said. She started to move past him. "You're Miss Ellis," he said. "Staying out at the Carter place." She stopped. She turned back slowly. "I am," she said. "And you're Mr. Whitmore from Helena. Word travels fast in small towns." He smiled. "I was actually hoping to speak with Mr. Carter at some point. I'm doing a land survey for the territorial government, and I'd like to discuss the boundaries of his eastern acreage." "I'm sure he'd be happy to discuss his land with you," Margaret said. "Once he's reviewed his documentation with his lawyer." Something shifted in Whitmore's expression. Just slightly. Just enough. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Though I wouldn't imagine there's any urgency for legal consultation on a routine survey." "In my experience," Margaret said, "when someone tells you something is routine, it rarely is." She smiled at him pleasantly and walked away. She could feel his eyes on her back for half the length of the street. She went directly to the telegraph office and sent a wire to a man she had worked with in Philadelphia, a land attorney named Sutton, who had handled 3 cases for Hargrove Shipping and who had a working relationship with offices in Helena. She explained the situation in the fewest possible words. She asked him to find out everything he could about Charles Whitmore and any recent activity involving Carter land in the territorial records. She sent a second telegram to Clara, who she had been in correspondence with since the first day and who had responded to every message with variations of "Come home, Maggie," that Margaret had been politely ignoring. She did not send that telegram to say she was staying. She sent it to ask Clara to look into one specific thing, the name of the company that had recently won a territorial contract for railroad route surveys in Montana. Clara knew people. Clara had always known the right people. It was one of her many useful qualities. She walked back to the ranch. William was fixing the gate hinge when she came up the road, and he looked at her the way he always looked at her when she'd been somewhere without explaining why, with a patience that asked nothing and somehow communicated everything. "I sent a telegram to a lawyer I know in Philadelphia," she said. He straightened up. "About the land. About Whitmore, and about the land registration question." She stopped in front of him. "William, someone flagged your eastern quarter in the Territorial Land Office last year, before Whitmore ever came to town. Someone started this process a year ago." He was very still. "That flag in the system means anyone who looks at your land gets sent straight to Helena," she said. "Whoever Whitmore is working for, they set this up in advance. They already know your registration has a gap. They're just waiting for the right moment to use it." William looked at the gate. He looked at the hinge he'd been working on. He looked at her. "I built this ranch with my hands," he said quietly. "After my father died. After everything else." She heard what was underneath those words. She had been learning the architecture of what William Carter said and what he didn't say, and she had figured out that the things he kept shortest were always the things that had cost him most. "You're not going to lose it," she said. "You can't know that. I know that I've dealt with people who use paperwork as a weapon, and I know how to fight them on their own ground." She held his look. "But I need you to trust me, and I need you to not do anything until we know more." "What does that mean? Not do anything?" It means if Whitmore comes to you directly, you listen, you say nothing, and you come back and tell me everything he said. His jaw worked for a second. She could see the part of him that wanted to handle this the way men on the frontier handled things directly, without lawyers, without patience. "William," she said. "I heard you," he said. "I know you heard me. I'm asking if you'll do it." A long pause. "I'll do it," he said. He went back to the gate hinge. She went inside. She sat at the table for a while, with nothing in front of her, just thinking. She thought about the Eastern Quarter, and the railroad, and a man in Helena who'd had enough access and enough foresight to plant a question in a land registry file a year before he sent anyone to Harlan Creek. She thought about the kind of money that kind of planning was protecting. She thought about William Carter, who had built his ranch with his hands after losing everything else. And she thought about the specific quality of unfairness in a world that gave a man something to hold on to, and then sent someone to take it from him the moment it was worth something. She thought about Gerald Holt's letter. Not the woman I envisioned. She thought about how many times in her life she had been dismissed before anyone bothered to look at what she could do. How many rooms she had walked into where people made their decisions in the first 5 seconds and then spent the next hour being surprised. She thought about how rage properly managed was one of the most useful things she owned. She picked up the ledger. She went back to work. Whitmore came to the ranch 4 days later. Margaret was in the north field, checking the fence posts she'd been monitoring for water table shift, when she saw the buggy coming up the road. She watched it from a distance long enough to confirm it was him, then walked back to the house at a pace that was faster than her usual, but slower than running because she didn't run. She reached the yard about 2 minutes before the buggy did. William came out of the barn when he heard the wheels. She was standing beside him when Whitmore pulled up, which was exactly where she'd intended to be. Whitmore stepped down from the buggy and smiled at both of them. "Mr. Carter, good afternoon. I hope I'm not interrupting your work." "What can I do for you, Mr. Whitmore?" William said. His voice was even. He'd listened to her. "I've been doing survey work in the county," Whitmore said, "and I find myself needing to clarify a few boundary questions for my report, specifically relating to the eastern section of your property." He reached into his satchel and produced a folded map. "Would you mind taking a look? I just need you to confirm the boundary markers." Margaret spoke before William could. "What organization did you say you were surveying for, Mr. Whitmore?" He looked at her. Something shifted again in his pleasant face, the same tiny recalibration she'd seen on the street. "The Territorial Land Commission," he said. "And you have credentials from them?" "Of course." He reached into the satchel again and produced a letter. She took it before he could offer it to William, read it carefully, noted the date, noted the signature, noted the specific language about his authority. "This authorizes survey work in Chouteau County," she said. "We're in Teton County." A beat of silence. "A clerical error," Whitmore said smoothly. "The commission issued updated credentials last week. I can have copies forwarded." "I'd appreciate that," she said. She handed the letter back to him. "We'd be happy to speak with you further once we've received the corrected documentation and had a chance to review it with our attorney." "Your attorney," Whitmore said. He was still smiling, but it had taken on an edge. "Miss Ellis is assisting me with the ranch's legal and financial records," William said. His voice had found something harder in it now. "If she says we wait for documentation, we wait." Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. "Of course," he said. "I'll have the documentation sent over." He put the letter back in his satchel and picked up the reins. "Though I'd encourage you not to wait too long, Mr. Carter. These survey windows don't stay open indefinitely." "Neither do our patients' windows," Margaret said pleasantly. He drove away. William watched the buggy until it was back on the road. Then he looked at her. "The county line thing," he said. "Was that real, or did you make it up?" "It was real," she said. "His credentials were for the wrong county, which means either he grabbed the wrong letter possible, or he doesn't actually have territorial authorization, and was hoping you wouldn't read carefully, more likely." "You read it in about 15 seconds. I read fast." She watched the road where the buggy had gone. "He's going to go back to town and recalibrate. He'll come at this differently next time. We need to know who he's working for before he does." The telegram from Clara arrived 2 days later. The company holding the railroad survey contract for northern Montana was called Consolidated Western Development. Its principal investor was a Helena businessman named Arthur Graves. Whitmore was listed as a company associate in the public territorial filings. Margaret read the telegram twice. Then she went to find the second piece of paper she'd been looking for in William's records, the one she hadn't mentioned to him yet, because she wanted to be sure before she said anything. She'd noticed it 3 days ago, tucked inside the back cover of a ledger from 1872. It was a handwritten letter from the Territorial Land Office, addressed to William's father, acknowledging receipt of the homestead extension application, and assigning it a reference number for processing. It was not a confirmation of registration, but it proved the application had been received. She set it beside the telegram. She sat for a very long time. Then she understood what had happened. Not guessed, understood. The application had been received. A reference number had been assigned. And then, at some point between 1872 and now, that application had disappeared from the territorial records. Not lost. Removed. Probably when Consolidated Western Development started looking at northern Montana land and realized the Carter Eastern Quarter sat directly in the path of the most economical route for their northern line. Someone had removed a document from an official government file to manufacture a legal vulnerability in land that a railroad company wanted. She picked up the acknowledgement letter very carefully, as if it might disappear if she moved too fast. "William," she called. He came in from the back of the house. She watched his face as she laid the telegram and the letter side by side on the table and explained what she'd put together. She watched him understand it the slow, deliberate way he understood things, without rushing to the conclusion before he'd examined the path. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "My father's land," he said. "Yes." Someone took a government document. Someone with access to Helena records, which narrows it significantly. And they've been sitting on this for how long? Long enough to be ready to move the moment the railroad survey confirmed the route. He stood up. He walked to the window. He put his hands flat on the sill, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, in the set of his jaw, in every line of his back. "William," she said. "I know," he said. "I know. Don't do anything yet." "I wasn't going to say that." He turned. "I was going to say," she said, "that you have more than you think you have. You have the acknowledgement letter. You have the timeline. You have Whitmore's irregular credentials. And you have a lawyer in Philadelphia who is currently pulling Consolidated Western Development's filings and looking for anything irregular in their land acquisition practices across the territory." He stared at her. "I asked Sutton to dig wider," she said. "If they did this to your land, they probably did it elsewhere. And documented fraud in a pattern is significantly harder to dismiss than a single disputed claim." He kept staring at her. "I know it's a lot," she said. "It's not too much," he said. "That's not what I—" He stopped. Started again. "Margaret, you have been here 3 weeks." 18 days, she said. 18 days. And you've found my fraudulent grain supplier, reorganized 3 years of ledgers, identified my undocumented land parcel, obtained a potentially critical piece of primary evidence, and engaged a Philadelphia attorney to investigate a Helena railroad company. "Yes," she said. "On my behalf." "On your behalf," she agreed. He looked at her in a way that was different from the ways he had looked at her before. Not assessment. Not the careful mapping of someone trying to understand what she was. Something more direct and more personal, and more unguarded than anything she had seen from him yet. "Why?" he said. She considered the question seriously. She always took his questions seriously. "Because someone should have done it years ago," she said. "And because I'm good at it. And because," she paused, "because I know what it is to have something of value that people tell you you're not entitled to keep. And I don't like it." He held her look for a long moment. "No one's ever—" He stopped himself. "What?" "Nothing." "William." He shook his head once, and she let it go, because she had learned which silences of his were closed doors, and which were simply gates that needed a little more time. But later that evening, sitting across from him at the kitchen table after supper, she looked up from the notes she was working on and found him watching her with an expression she had no name for, yet open and quiet and uncertain in a way she had never seen on his face. And he looked away the moment he saw her notice it, and she looked back down at her notes. Her hands were very steady. Her heart was not. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she was here to help him fight for his land, and then she would send her next telegram east and figure out what came after. She told herself that right up until the night Tommy Briggs came running to the ranch at 8:30 with a piece of news that changed the shape of everything. Ellen Marsh, the woman from the general store. The woman with the tight mouth and the sideways eyes. The woman. Margaret had faced down in front of half the town, had been to see Judge Alderman that afternoon. She had filed a formal claiming that William Carter had taken in a woman of questionable character, and that this woman was interfering in county land matters that were none of her business. And Judge Alderman, who had been meeting privately with Charles Whitmore twice a week since the man arrived, had agreed to hear the complaint. Tommy delivered this information in one breathless rush, looking between them both with the focused urgency of someone who understood exactly what he was carrying. William said nothing for a count of 5. Then he said, "Ellen Marsh has wanted to cause trouble for this ranch since my father refused to sell her husband that pasture in 1869. That's not the problem," Margaret said. Her voice was calm. "The problem is, Whitmore has a line to the judge, and now the judge has a reason to look at this ranch that doesn't involve land fraud. If they can make my presence here a matter of public record and public question, they can use it to distract from what we're building against them." Tommy was watching her with the focused awe of a boy witnessing something he'd remember. "What do we do?" William said. "We go to that hearing," Margaret said. "We go, we answer every question plainly and without apology, and we let them see that we're not afraid of their attention." She paused. "And between now and then, we need everything we can get from Sutton. And if Sutton doesn't have enough in time..." She looked at him steadily. "Then I'll go to Helena myself," she said. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. William looked at her. She could see a dozen things moving through him. Protest, concern, calculation, and underneath all of it, something that was neither gratitude nor need, but was not entirely different from both. "You'd do that," he said. "I'd do that," she said. He held her look for a long time. Then he said in a voice that was quieter than anything she'd heard from him yet, "I don't know what you came to Montana looking for, Margaret, but I know what you found." She didn't answer that. She didn't trust herself to. She looked back down at her notes and kept working, and outside the night came down over the Carter Ranch, and inside the stakes of everything had just gotten considerably higher, and neither of them said another word about it, because some things only survived the silence they were kept in for now. The hearing was set for a Thursday. Margaret had 5 days. She spent the first 2 of them writing letters to Sutton in Philadelphia, to the Territorial Land Commission office in Helena, through an intermediary contact Sutton had provided, and to a woman named Ruth Alderman, who happened to be the judge's sister-in-law, and who had, according to Tommy Briggs's inexhaustible intelligence network, not spoken to her brother-in-law in 3 years over a property dispute of her own. Margaret did not write to Ruth Alderman about the hearing. She wrote to her about land documentation procedures framed as a general inquiry, and included 3 specific questions that she knew would make a woman who had lost a land dispute think very carefully about who she knew and what she might be willing to say. It was a long shot. Margaret was comfortable with long shots. She'd been one her whole life. On the 3rd day, William came to find her at the table where she'd been working since before sunrise, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before he said anything, which was how she knew it was something he'd been thinking about for a while. "You don't have to go to that hearing," he said. She looked up. "They're going after you because of me," he said. "Because you've been staying here, and people have been talking, and Whitmore needed a lever. If you leave before Thursday, go back east like you'd planned, there's no complaint to hear. Marsh loses her case before it starts." She set down her pen. "And your eastern quarter," she said. "That's my fight. It became my fight the day I found that acknowledgement letter in your father's ledger." "Margaret." "William." She said his name the way she said everything that mattered, quietly, without decoration. "I am not leaving because a man with a railroad contract found it convenient to make me a problem. If I left every room where someone decided I was a problem, I would have run out of rooms a very long time ago." She picked up her pen. "I'm going to the hearing. We're going together. And we're going to be so thoroughly, documentably, boringly respectable that Ellen Marsh is going to wish she'd kept her mouth shut." He looked at her for a long moment. "Boringly respectable," he repeated. "It is an underutilized strategy." Something that was almost a laugh moved through his face. He shook his head once and went back to his work, and she went back to hers. And the kitchen held the particular warmth of two people who have stopped negotiating about whether they're on the same side. The fourth day brought a telegram from Sutton. She read it twice, standing at the telegraph office counter, then folded it carefully into her coat pocket and walked back to the ranch without stopping to speak to anyone, which was difficult, because Tommy Briggs appeared out of nowhere, halfway down the street, and fell into step beside her with the persistence of a small but determined weather system. "You got a telegram," he said. "I did." "Good news or bad?" "Yes," she said. He digested that. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now, Tommy." He peeled off at the edge of town, and she walked the rest of the way alone, and when she reached the ranch, William was on the porch, and he read her face before she said a word. "Tell me," he said. She sat down on the porch step, and he sat beside her, and she unfolded the telegram. Sutton had found 3 other ranchers in the Northern Territory whose land registration showed anomalies similar to William's GAPS flags, missing confirmation records. 2 of them had already been pressured to sell to Consolidated Western Development at below-market prices. The third had refused and was currently in a legal dispute that he appeared to be losing because his documentation was incomplete. He had also found something else. The Land Commission official, who had authority over the Northern Survey Registry, a man named Harold Pratt, had resigned his position 6 months ago, under circumstances that weren't publicly explained, and had relocated to Denver. Sutton had tracked him down. He hadn't yet spoken to him, but he had found him. "Pratt is the man who would have processed your father's extension application in 1872, Margaret said. "He had access to the records, he had the authority to flag a file, and he left his position 6 months before Whitmore showed up in Harlan Creek." William was very still beside her. "Sutton thinks he can get Pratt to talk," he said. "He thinks Pratt might already want to. Men who leave government positions the way he did quietly, suddenly, with no explanation, are often men who did something they'd like to have undone." She refolded the telegram. "The question is whether Sutton can get anything usable before Thursday. And if he can't, then we go into that hearing with what we have and we make it count." She said it with more certainty than she felt, and she thought he probably knew that, but he didn't call her on it. That was another thing she'd learned about William Carter. He understood the difference between confidence and honesty, and he never punished her for the moments when she needed both at once. Thursday came the way difficult days always come, too fast and with no ceremony. The hearing was held in Judge Alderman's office, which was above the general store and smelled like pipe smoke and old paper, and the particular staleness of a room where people came to be told what they couldn't do. Margaret walked in wearing her second-best dress, which was better than her best dress in a way only women understood, composed, controlled, impossible to dismiss. William walked in beside her with his hat in his hands and his jaw set and his boots clean, and she felt the weight of his presence beside her, the way you feel solid ground after uncertain footing. Ellen Marsh was already seated with 2 women from her social circle arranged behind her like witnesses to a verdict they'd already decided. She looked at Margaret when they walked in, and her mouth went thin and satisfied the expression of a woman who believes the trouble she started is about to finish exactly the way she planned it. Charles Whitmore was not in the room. Margaret noted that immediately, the way she noted everything that was absent when she'd expected it to be present. Judge Alderman was a man in his early 60s, broad across the shoulders, with the settled authority of someone who'd been the largest presence in every room he'd entered for 30 years. He looked at Margaret with the flat assessment of a man who had already formed his opinion and was going through the formality of confirming it. "Miss Ellis," he said, I understand you've been residing at the Carter property for approximately 3 weeks. 22 days, she said. Yes, Your Honor. And in what capacity? I was offered temporary shelter after being stranded in Harlan Creek without lodging, she said. I've been assisting Mr. Carter with his ranch records and supply management in exchange for room and board. Assisting, Alderman said with the particular intonation of a man who wants a word to mean something other than what it means. She met his eyes. Accounting ledger organization, documentation review, supplier correspondence, she said. Would you like a list of specific tasks? I can provide one. Ellen Marsh made a small sound. One of her companions leaned over and whispered something. Mrs. Marsh has raised a concern, Alderman said, about the propriety of an unmarried woman residing at a single man's property. Mrs. Marsh is welcome to her concern, Margaret said. Though I'd note that propriety has not been the actual subject of her concern in any conversation I've overheard. The subject has been whether a woman of my physical description is an appropriate presence in this community. Those are two different conversations, and I'd like to know which one we're officially having. The room went very quiet. William to her right did not move. But she felt something change in him, a settling like a man who has just heard his own thoughts said aloud by someone braver than he knew how to be. Alderman's eyes narrowed slightly. The complaint is about propriety, Miss Ellis. Then I'll address propriety, she said. I am a guest in Mr. Carter's home in a separate sleeping room with my own entrance. I have conducted myself with complete decorum. I have assisted in the management of a working ranch. I have committed no violation of any law or reasonable standard of conduct. If Mrs. Marsh would like to specify what exactly she believes I have done wrong, I would appreciate the specificity, because this, she gestured at the room, at the arrangement of chairs, at the whole constructed theater of it, is taking up time that I could be spending on work that actually matters. Ellen Marsh's face had gone the color of a brick. Young woman, Alderman said with the careful, measured tone of a man reasserting authority. I would remind you that this is my court. I respect that, Margaret said. Which is why I've answered every question directly and honestly. I'd ask the same in return. William's hand, which had been resting on his knee, moved half an inch toward her. Not touching, just closer. Alderman looked at William. Mr. Carter, do you have anything to add? Only that Miss Ellis has conducted herself with more integrity than most people I've known, William said, and that this complaint is being used to distract attention from a separate matter involving my land that I intend to address formally in the coming weeks. Alderman's face changed. Something moved behind his eyes, calculation, or the recognition that he had miscalculated, or something between the two. What separate matter? He said. A question of land registration fraud, William said, involving a Helena Land Company and certain territorial record filings. I expect to have documentation in order shortly. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man trying to determine how much someone else knows and how fast he needs to move. I'm not aware of any such matter, Alderman said. I wouldn't expect you to be, William said. Yet. Alderman looked at Margaret, then back at William. He picked up a pen and made a note on something in front of him. I'm going to dismiss Mrs. Marsh's complaint for insufficient grounds, he said in a voice that had lost some of its settled authority. Miss Ellis, you're free to continue your stay at the Carter property provided there are no further complaints. There won't be, Margaret said. She did not look at Ellen Marsh when she said it. She didn't need to. They walked out of Alderman's office, and down the stairs, and into the street, and when the door closed behind them, Margaret let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 45 minutes. William stopped on the boardwalk and looked at her. You told him about the fraud, she said. Before we have everything. He needed to know we knew, William said. Whatever he's mixed up in with Whitmore, and I believe he's mixed up in it. He needed to understand that walking away from Marsh's complaint was the safer move. She looked at him. You calculated that, she said. You're not the only one who thinks, he said. His voice was dry, but not unkind. She felt something warm move through her that she did not examine closely. Fair point, she said. They were 3 steps off the boardwalk when Whitmore appeared. He came from the direction of the hotel, walking at an angle that was clearly designed to intercept them, and he did it smoothly enough that a casual observer might think it was accidental. He was not smiling this time. The pleasant face was still there, but the pleasantness had thinned. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I heard the hearing went well." "It went correctly," William said, "which is all I asked. I understand you mentioned some concerns about land documentation." Whitmore's voice was careful. "I want you to know that Consolidated Western Development has always operated in full compliance with territorial law. Any irregularities in the survey record would be purely administrative." "You just confirmed you work for Consolidated Western Development," Margaret said. Whitmore stopped. "To my knowledge," she continued, "you've told everyone in Harlan Creek you're here on behalf of the Territorial Land Commission, which is an independent body. If you're actually representing a private railroad development company, that's a significant distinction, particularly in matters involving land acquisition." Whitmore looked at her. She looked back. "My credentials are in order," he said. "For the wrong county," she said. "As we established." He breathed in through his nose. The pleasant face was working hard now to stay pleasant. "Miss Ellis," he said, "I don't know what you think you've found, but I'd encourage you to be careful. You're a long way from Philadelphia, and you have no legal standing in Montana land matters." "She doesn't need legal standing," William said. "She needs to be right, and she is." Whitmore looked between them. "I'm going to offer you one more opportunity," he said, and there was something different in his voice now, harder with less effort at friendliness. "The railroad is coming through this county, Mr. Carter. It's not a question of if, it's a question of which ranchers profit from it, and which ones spend the next 3 years in legal proceedings that cost them more than the land is worth. I'm offering you a clean exit at a fair price." "How much?" William said. Whitmore named a number. It was not a bad number. It was the number of a man who had done his research and knew exactly how much was enough to be tempting without being suspicious. William looked at it for a moment. Just a moment. "No," he said. "William," Whitmore started. "No," William said again. "I built that ranch. My father built that ranch before me. The Eastern Quarter has been Carter land for 15 years, and it is going to stay Carter land. You want a route for your railroad, you find one that doesn't go through what's mine." Whitmore looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Margaret. "When this is over," he said quietly, "and it will be over, Miss Ellis, I hope you understand that you were the reason it got complicated." "I've been the reason things got complicated my entire life," she said. "I've learned to consider it a compliment." He walked away. William didn't speak for a moment. Then so low she almost didn't catch it. That was a threat. "Yes," she said. "He's going to move faster now." "Yes," she said again. "What do we do?" She was already thinking 3 steps ahead, arranging pieces on a board that Whitmore believed he controlled, and she could see the shape of what needed to happen, and the exact sequence it needed to happen in, and the problem was that 2 of those steps required things she didn't have yet, and the timing was going to be very close. "We need Pratt," she said. "Sutton needs to get to Pratt today. If Pratt confirms that the registration was removed from the file and can name who authorized it. We have fraud, not just a gap in documentation. Fraud is criminal, not administrative. Criminal charges against Whitmore or his company changes everything. It changes the judge's calculus. It changes the county's response. It potentially involves the territorial marshal rather than just the local court." And if Pratt won't talk? She didn't answer immediately, and he recognized the pause for what it was. "Margaret," he said. "There's a second option," she said. "But I need you to trust me completely and not argue about it." That's never a sentence that ends comfortably. "I know. Trust me anyway." He looked at her. She could feel the full weight of his attention, the way he gave it when he'd decided something mattered completely, without reservation, the way he did everything. "All right," he said. She sent the telegram to Sutton that afternoon, with language more urgent than anything she'd sent before. She told him exactly what Whitmore had said, exactly what had been threatened, and exactly what she needed and when she needed it. She received a reply that evening that was 2 words found him. She sat with those two words for a long time. She was still sitting with them at midnight when she heard William's boots on the kitchen floor and looked up to find him standing in the doorway in his work shirt, his hair unruly from sleep, holding 2 cups of coffee he must have made without her hearing. He set one in front of her without asking if she wanted it. "You've been in here since supper," he said. "I've been thinking." "I know." He sat down. "You make a specific kind of quiet when you're thinking." She looked at him. "What kind?" "The kind that sounds like a room before a storm." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "Tell me what you're afraid of." She opened her mouth to say she wasn't afraid. She closed it again, because the truth was that she was afraid of exactly one thing, and it had nothing to do with Whitmore or the land or the hearing or Harold Pratt in Denver. It had to do with the way William had said she doesn't need legal standing, she needs to be right, and she is. And the way his hand had moved half an inch toward her in Alderman's office, and the way he was sitting across from her right now at midnight with coffee he'd made without being asked, and the way all of it was adding up to something she hadn't planned for when she'd picked up her trunk and walked 2 miles in the Montana sun to a gate she'd never seen before. She was afraid she was starting to count on something she hadn't been offered. "I'm afraid of getting this wrong," she said. "The land case. If Pratt doesn't give Sutton what we need, and we've already tipped our hand to Whitmore." "Margaret," he said quietly, "what are you actually afraid of?" The kitchen was very still. She looked at her coffee cup. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "Whatever this is, I know how to work. I know how to fight. I know how to read a ledger and build a case and face down a room full of people who want me to be less than I am." She paused. "I don't know how to be in a place where someone makes me coffee at midnight because they noticed I was quiet." He was very still across from her. "Gerald Holt wrote me 17 letters," she said. "I read every one of them carefully. I thought I was being practical. I thought I had accounted for every risk." She looked up. "I didn't account for the possibility that the right place and the right person would look nothing like what I expected." The silence stretched between them. William set down his cup. "I haven't talked to anyone the way I talk to you," he said, "in longer than I can account for. Maybe ever." He said it simply, without drama, without decoration. "I don't know what to do with that any more than you do." "We're a pair," she said almost to herself. "We are," he agreed. They looked at each other across the table for a long moment, and there was something enormous in the room with them that neither of them was ready to name yet, so they didn't name it. They just sat with it in the particular piece of two people who have stopped pretending they don't feel what they feel, even if they haven't said it out loud. She went to bed an hour later. She slept better than she had since Pennsylvania. The telegram from Sutton came on a Saturday morning, and it was longer than anything he'd sent before, which meant he'd paid a significant telegraph fee, which meant he'd found something significant. Harold Pratt had talked. He had talked for 3 hours with Sutton taking notes, and what he said was both worse and better than Margaret had expected. Worse because the fraud was more organized than she'd imagined. It wasn't one man making one decision. It was a deliberate scheme running through 3 levels of the Territorial Land Commission, coordinated with Consolidated Western Development's acquisition team over a period of 18 months. Better because Pratt had kept records. Personal records in a locked box in his home in Denver, because he was the kind of man who did something wrong and immediately started building himself a way out. He had names. He had dates. He had copies of altered documents and the originals of instructions he'd received from above. He was prepared to testify, in exchange for immunity from prosecution and relocation assistance. Harold Pratt was prepared to tell the territorial marshal everything he knew about Consolidated Western Development's land acquisition scheme, including the specific names of commission officials who had altered registration records, the list of properties affected, and the name of the man at Consolidated Western who had designed the entire operation. His name was Arthur Graves, the principal investor, the man at the top. Margaret read the telegram, standing at the telegraph office counter, and felt something very specific, not triumph, not relief, but the particular quiet satisfaction of a pattern that had been broken open, finally revealing its center. She sent Sutton 3 instructions. Secure Pratt's cooperation, formally contact the Territorial Marshal's office directly with a summary of the evidence and prepare documentation for an emergency land claim review on the Carter Eastern Quarter. Then she walked home. William was in the yard, and he saw her face before she reached the gate. "Pratt talked," she said. He went very still. "All of it," he said. "All of it. Names, documents, the whole scheme. He has originals, William. He kept originals." She stopped in front of him. "Arthur Graves ordered the removal of your father's registration. Your land was flagged specifically because of the railroad route. This wasn't opportunistic, they targeted you." Something moved through his face that was complicated and old, and not entirely about the land. "My father filed that paperwork in 1872, he said. He died in 1879. He spent 7 years believing that land was secured." "It was," she said. "It always was. The fraud is in the record, not in your family's claim. Your father did everything right. What happened to his filing was done to him, not by him." She hadn't planned to say that last part. It came out because it was true, and because she could see in the way he was holding himself that he had been carrying something about his father's record that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with legacy. His jaw tightened. He looked away briefly. "Thank you," he said. His voice was rough with something she recognized, the specific roughness of a man trying to contain something too large for the moment. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Whitmore is going to find out we've talked to Pratt. Probably within a day or two. When he does, he'll move," William said, pulling himself back into the problem with the focused practicality she'd come to rely on from him. "He'll try to do something before the marshal can get involved. He'll go after the land directly. Some kind of emergency injunction, a competing claim, anything that puts a legal hold on the property while his people work their connections in Helena." "Can he do that fast enough?" "If he has the right people in the right offices," she said. "Yes." William looked at her. "Then we have to move first," he said. "We have to move today," she said. He nodded once. The decisiveness in him was immediate and absolute. Once he saw the path, he moved on it. No hesitation, no second guessing. "Tell me what you need," he said. "I need you to ride to the Hendersons, the McAllister place, and the Fowler Ranch," she said. "Every rancher in this county who might have the same documentation gap needs to know what's happening before Whitmore can spin this in his favor. They need to know they're not alone, and they need to know there's a way to fight. That's 5 hours of riding." "I know." "What will you be doing?" "I'll be here drafting the formal land claim review request with everything Sutton sent and sending a direct communication to the territorial marshal's office that doesn't go through aldermen." He started for the barn. "William," she said. He turned. "Be careful," she said. "Whitmore threatened me in the street this morning. He knows we have something. The men he works for do not respond gently to being exposed." He looked at her for a moment with that open, unguarded thing she'd been seeing more often now, the face of a man who has stopped performing carefully and started simply being. "I'll be back before dark," he said. He was back before dark, but he was not alone. He rode in with James Henderson, Frank McAllister, and 2 of the Fowler brothers. 4 men on horseback, their faces set with the particular purpose of men who have been told something and have decided what to do about it. Margaret came out to the yard and looked at all of them. "They want to be part of this," William said from the saddle. "All of them," she said. "Henderson's got the same documentation gap. McAllister was already approached by Whitmore last month, made a low offer on his western pasture, and wouldn't explain why. The Fowlers turned down an offer last spring that they didn't understand at the time." He paused. "They understand it now." She looked at the 4 men. They looked back at her with the steady attention of people assessing something they need to trust. James Henderson, who was the oldest, touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am," he said, "Bill tells us you've got a way to fight this." "I have the beginning of one," she said honestly. "It requires documentation timing and several things going correctly in the right order. It's not guaranteed." "Nothing's guaranteed," Henderson said. "But a woman who backed down Ellen Marsh and made Whitmore blink twice in 1 week is a woman worth listening to." She looked at William. He was watching her with that expression again, the one that was not assessment and not gratitude and not dependence, but something that lived in the space where all 3 of those things could have been and had chosen to become something else entirely. "All right," she said. "Come inside, all of you. I'll explain what we have and what we're going to do with it." They came inside. Margaret spread the documents across the table. Sutton's telegrams, the acknowledgement letter from 1872, her notes on Whitmore's credentials, the timeline she'd built from everything she'd gathered. She stood at the head of the table, and she talked. She talked for 40 minutes. Nobody interrupted. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. Then Frank McAllister said, "What do you need from us?" And Margaret Ellis, who had arrived at William Carter's gate 26 days ago, with a broken heart and a single trunk, and the last remnant of her dignity, who had been left in the dust by a man who decided she wasn't what he'd envisioned, who had been laughed at and whispered about and dragged before a judge and threatened in the street. Margaret Ellis looked around the table at the faces watching her and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "I need your documentation," she said. "Every deed, every filing, every receipt, every letter from the land office going back as far as you have. I need it all, and I need it by tomorrow morning." "You'll have it," Henderson said. Outside, the Montana night was coming down. Inside, something had shifted in the county forever, and Charles Whitmore, who was sitting in the Harlan Creek Hotel not 2 miles away, had no idea yet how much ground he'd already lost. But he was about to find out. The 4 ranchers left near midnight with instructions they understood and a timeline that left no room for error. Margaret stayed up until 2 in the morning, organizing everything into a single package. Sutton's telegrams, the 1872 acknowledgement letter, her timeline, her notes on Whitmore's credential discrepancy, and the preliminary documentation from each rancher about their own land gaps. She arranged it in the order a marshal's office would need to read it, with a cover letter that stated the facts without editorializing. Because she had learned a long time ago that the documents that changed things were the ones that didn't need to tell you how to feel about them. When she finally set down her pen, the house was completely quiet. She sat for a moment in the stillness. She thought about Philadelphia, about her desk at Hargrove Shipping, which faced a window that looked out onto a brick wall. About the walk to work she'd made 5 days a week for 4 years, past the same bakery, the same church steps, the same iron fence on Callaway Street. About how certain she had been reading Gerald Holt's 17th letter, that leaving all of it was the right thing to do. She had been right. Just not for the reasons she'd thought. She heard William's boots on the floor above her. He'd gone up to his room when the ranchers left, but clearly hadn't slept. And then the sound stopped, and she thought about what he'd said the other night at the table, about not having talked to anyone the way he talked to her, maybe ever. She thought about how he'd said it, simply, without making it into something she had to manage. She put out the lamp and went to bed. She was up before 5. William was already in the kitchen. He'd made coffee that wasn't burned, which she noted with something that wasn't quite a smile, but was close to it. He put a cup in front of her before she sat down. "The package is ready," he said. "It's ready." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "I need to get it to the marshal's office in Helena without going through the local postal system. Alderman has friends in too many places." "I know someone," William said. "Writer named Cole Marsh, no relation to Ellen before you ask. He runs private dispatch out of Great Falls. Fast, reliable, doesn't ask questions. Can you reach him today?" "I can send Tommy with a message this morning. Cole can be here by tomorrow evening." "That's too slow," she said. "Whitmore's going to move within 48 hours. If he files an emergency injunction before the marshal has our documentation." "Then I'll go myself," William said. She looked at him. "I'll take the package to Cole directly instead of waiting for him to come here. It cuts a day off the timeline." He held her look. "I can be in Great Falls by nightfall if I leave in the next hour." "That's 30 miles. I know how far it is." She thought about it. She ran the timeline in her head the way she ran numbers, fast, checking and rechecking, looking for the place where the logic broke. "If you leave now," she said, "and Cole dispatches tonight, the package reaches Helena day after tomorrow. The marshal's office would have it before market open on Wednesday. And Whitmore's earliest move is Tuesday at best if he's working through normal channels. But if he has someone inside the Land Commission who can push an emergency filing." "Then Monday," William said. "Monday," she agreed. They looked at each other across the table. "Go," she said. He stood up. He put his hat on. He picked up the package she'd prepared and checked the seal without being asked, careful, thorough even now. He stopped at the door. "If anything happens while I'm gone," he said, "anything at all, you send for Henderson. Don't handle Whitmore alone." "I've been handling difficult men alone for 25 years, she said. "I know that," he said. "I'm asking anyway." She looked at him. He was standing with the package under his arm and his hat squared and his face doing that open, unguarded thing. And she thought about how a month ago, this man had been a stranger who opened a gate, and now he was the person she planned around. The person she calibrated her timing against the person whose coffee she noticed. "I'll send for Henderson if it's necessary," she said. He held her look for one more moment. Then he walked out. She heard him saddle bay. She heard the horse move out of the yard. She listened until she couldn't hear hoofbeats anymore, and then she turned back to the table and picked up her pen. She had work to do. Whitmore moved on Sunday. She had expected Monday at the earliest. She had been wrong, which was the kind of wrong that arrived in the form of Tommy Briggs, appearing at the ranch door at 10 in the morning, with his hair uncombed and his chest heaving from running. "He filed something," Tommy said before she could ask. "Yesterday evening. I heard it from the judge's clerk this morning. Whitmore filed an emergency land survey dispute on behalf of Consolidated Western, claiming an unresolved territorial boundary on the Carter Eastern Quarter. Alderman signed it." Margaret set down her pen very slowly. "Alderman signed an emergency filing on a Saturday evening," she said. "Clerk said he came to the judge's house. Alderman signed it there." She was already on her feet. "What does the filing do?" Tommy asked, following her to the desk where she'd been working. "It creates a legal cloud over the land title," she said. "While the dispute is open, William can't sell, can't use the land as collateral, can't transfer it. And if Whitmore can get a hearing scheduled before we get our response to the marshal, can he do that? He already got a judge to sign an emergency filing on a Saturday night." She pulled on her coat. "Yes, he can do that." She sent 3 messages inside the next hour. One to Henderson telling him what had happened and asking him to alert McAllister and the Fowlers. One to Sutton in Philadelphia, asking him to contact the Territorial Marshal's office directly by telegraph today. Sunday emergency, she didn't care what it cost. And one to William at the Coal Marsh Dispatch office in Great Falls, a single line Whitmore filed Sunday. Move fast. Then she sat down and thought. The filing was strategic. She understood its logic. Whitmore had seen them mobilizing, understood that they had something, and moved to create a legal obstacle that would tie up the land in procedural dispute long enough for his people in Helena to work their connections. It was the move of a man who was losing, and knew it, which made it more dangerous, not less. Desperate strategy from intelligent people was the hardest kind to counter, because it didn't follow predictable patterns. What he had not accounted for, she believed, and she needed to be right about this, was Harold Pratt. Because Pratt wasn't just evidence. Pratt was a government official who had participated in systematic fraud, who had kept records of that participation, and who was prepared to testify. That wasn't a civil land dispute. That was a criminal matter. And a criminal matter properly filed could supersede an emergency civil filing the way a river supersedes a ditch. The question was whether Sutton could get the marshal's office moving on a Sunday. She found out at 3 in the afternoon, when a telegram arrived that was longer than any single telegram she'd ever received and cost what she guessed was close to 2 months of a clerk's salary. Sutton had reached the territorial marshal's deputy at home. The deputy had read the summary. The deputy had sent a rider to the marshal's ranch house that morning. The marshal had read it. And the territorial marshal of Montana, a man named Beaumont Ward, who had held the office for 11 years and had a reputation that made people speak carefully, in his presence had decided that this was not a matter for Monday morning. He was dispatching 2 deputies to Harlan Creek. They would arrive Tuesday. She sat with that telegram for a long time. Then she sent one back to Sutton. "Tuesday is enough. Thank you." Henderson came by that afternoon with McAllister, and she told them what had happened, the filing. Sutton's telegram, the marshal's decision. She watched their faces as she talked. Henderson went through 3 distinct expressions in about 30 seconds alarm calculation, and then something that settled into a kind of determined calm. 2 days, he said. 2 days, she confirmed. We need to stay quiet and stay put. No confrontations with Whitmore, no public statements. Nothing that gives him a reason to move again before Ward's deputies arrive. What about Alderman? McAllister said. Alderman is going to have a significant problem on his hands when the marshal's office arrives, she said. Signing that emergency filing on behalf of a man who's under federal investigation is not a position a judge wants to be in. He may try to distance himself before Tuesday. Or he may try to make more trouble, Henderson said. Either way. Margaret said, we don't engage, we wait. They left. She went back to work. William came home Monday morning. She was in the yard when he rode in, and she knew from the way he was sitting on bay forward tense the posture of a man who'd pushed hard and hadn't rested that he'd ridden through the night. He was off the horse before it fully stopped. The filing, he said. I handled it, she said. The marshal is sending deputies. They arrive tomorrow. He stopped. He looked at her. You handled it, he said. Sutton reached the marshal's deputy at home on Sunday. Pratt's testimony was enough to make it a criminal matter. Ward is coming. William stood in the yard with his horse blowing behind him and the morning light coming in low and gold, and he looked at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not the quiet assessment, not the almost smile, not the open, unguarded thing. Something more fundamental than all of those. Something that looked like a man arriving somewhere he hadn't known he was trying to get to. I rode through the night, he said. I was afraid I'd get back and... I know, she said. Margaret. William, she said. Take care of your horse, then come inside and eat something. We have one more day to get through, and I need you clear-headed. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he led Bay toward the barn. She went inside and started breakfast. Monday was the longest day. Not because anything happened, because nothing did, and the waiting had a particular weight to it that was different from the ordinary tension of work. She kept busy. She reviewed the documentation package one more time, checking every page, every date, every reference. She wrote out a clean timeline of events to give the deputies on arrival. She organized Sutton's communications in chronological order. She did everything she could think of to do, and then she sat at the table with William and they played cards. Actual cards with an old deck he found in a drawer, because she needed something that required attention without requiring thought, and he understood that without her having to explain it. He won 3 out of 5 hands. She accused him of cheating. He denied it with the dignity of a man who absolutely cheated. She laughed. Really laughed. Not the careful, managed kind she usually produced in social situations, but the unguarded kind that came from somewhere she didn't usually let people reach, and he looked at her when she laughed with an expression that was so plainly helplessly fond that she looked back down at her cards because she didn't know what to do with it yet. You're not going back to Philadelphia, he said. It wasn't a question. She kept her eyes on her cards. I haven't decided that, she said. I think you have. William. I'm not asking you to stay for the ranch, he said. I want to be clear about that. She looked up. He was holding his cards but not looking at them. He was looking at her with the directness he brought to everything important. No decoration, no preamble, just the thing itself. The ranch is better because you're here, he said. But that's not why I'm saying it. I'm saying it because this house is different with you in it. I'm different. He paused. I had forgotten what it felt like to look forward to something. The kitchen was very quiet. She set her cards down. I'm not easy to know, she said. I'm stubborn, and I have opinions about everything, and I will reorganize your ledgers without asking. I know that. I will always be exactly the size I am, and there will always be people who... Margaret. His voice was quiet and certain. I know who you are. I've been watching you for 4 weeks. I know exactly who you are. She looked at him across the table. You never made me feel like I needed to be smaller, she said. And she hadn't meant to say it quite that directly, but it was out now, and it was true. You're not small, he said. In any sense. Why would I want that? She felt something move through her that she'd been holding back for weeks. Not grief this time, Not the tightly managed survival feeling she'd been running on since she arrived, but something warmer and more frightening and more real. "I need more time," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not saying no. I know that too." The almost smile was there. "I'm a patient man." She picked her cards back up. "You cheated," she said. "Absolutely," he agreed. She won the next two hands by a margin that was entirely legitimate. Tuesday arrived. The marshal's deputies rode into Harlan Creek at 10:30 in the morning. Two men named Garrett and Sills, both experienced both with the quiet authority of people who had done this work long enough to not need to perform it. They came to the Carter Ranch first, which meant someone had briefed them on the chain of events, which meant the marshal's office had done its preparation. Margaret met them at the gate with her documentation package. Deputy Garrett took it and spent 20 minutes reading it at the kitchen table while his partner spoke with William. He read the way she liked to see people read important documents completely without rushing, going back to recheck things rather than forward to get it done. When he finished, he set it down and looked at her. "You put this together," he said. "I did." "You're not a lawyer." "No. This is better organized than most legal filings I receive from actual lawyers." "I have experience with documentation," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the professional assessment of a man who categorizes people by their usefulness. Whatever category he put her in, he appeared satisfied with it. "Pratt's statement is in Helena," he said. "We have it. It corroborates everything in your timeline." He tapped the documentation package. "This fills in the county-level picture. Together, it's enough to move on Whitmore today." "And Alderman's filing," she said. "An emergency land survey dispute filed by a subject of a federal fraud investigation has no legal standing," Garrett said. "It's void the moment we serve Whitmore with the criminal complaint." She breathed in slowly. "What happens now?" she said. "We go find Mr. Whitmore," he said, "and we have a conversation he's not going to enjoy." She was not in the room when it happened. She was in the yard with William when the deputy's wagon came back down the main road past the ranch 2 hours later, and through the wagon's window she could see Charles Whitmore sitting very still with his hands folded in his lap, and his pleasant face finally completely absent its pleasantness. William stood beside her, and they both watched the wagon pass. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "It's over." "The immediate part," she said. "There'll be a legal process. Depositions. A hearing in Helena, probably. Sutton will need to be involved." "But the ranch." "The ranch is yours," she said. "The Eastern Quarter is yours. It was always yours. This just makes it official." He was quiet. She felt him looking at her. "Say it," she said. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You don't have to." "Margaret." "William, you opened a gate for a woman who had nowhere to go. You gave her a room and work and coffee, and you never once made her feel like she was less than she was. That's not something I can accept thanks for, because it wasn't a favor. It was just—" She stopped. "It was just what—" he said softly. "It was just what people should do for each other," she said. "And it's rarer than it should be." I was very close now, closer than he usually stood, and she was aware of it. The way you're aware of a change in temperature, not dramatically, but completely. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to answer honestly, not practically. Those are usually the same thing for me. This time I'm asking for honest first," he said. "Practical can come after." She looked up at him. "Do you want to stay?" he said. "Not because the ranch needs you. Not because you have nowhere else to go. You have somewhere else. You have Clara and Philadelphia, and a career you could rebuild. I'm asking if you want to be here, this place, this life." A pause. "With me." The Montana afternoon was completely quiet around them. She thought about the cottonwood tree she'd said she would sleep under if he turned her away. She thought about the burned coffee she'd taken out of his hands that first morning. She thought about the ledger and the fence posts and the hearing room and the kitchen table at midnight and the sound of his boots overhead when he couldn't sleep. She thought about the fact that for the first time in her adult life, she had spent weeks being entirely herself. Not smaller, not managed, Not the version that fit into rooms that weren't built for her, and the person who had given her space to do that was standing 2 feet away asking her a question. "Yes," she said. Just that. Just yes. She'd spent enough words in her life on answers that required more. This one didn't. His face did something she hadn't seen before. Something that opened completely, without the careful guard he usually kept, and it was almost startling how much younger it made him look, how much lighter. "Practical next," she said. "I have conditions." He almost laughed. "Of course you do. I want to continue the records work, not just for this ranch, for the other ranchers in the county. McAllister and Henderson both need their documentation reviewed, and I want to help the Fowlers understand their land rights before anyone else tries what Whitmore tried." "Done," he said. "I want Clara to visit. She'll come whether I invite her or not, but I'd prefer to invite her." "She sounds like you," he said. "I look forward to it." "And I want—" She stopped. "What?" She looked at him. "I want you to ask me properly. Not right now. When you're ready. But I want you to ask." He held her look. "I'll ask," he said. Certain. Quiet. No performance. She nodded once. She turned back toward the house. "Margaret," he said. She stopped. "For what it's worth," he said, "Gerald Holt is the biggest fool in the Montana Territory." She stood still for a moment. Then she said without turning around, "He really truly is." She walked inside. She sat at the table. She pulled the ledger toward her. She picked up her pen. Outside, she could hear William moving in the yard, the sounds of a man going about his work on a Tuesday afternoon in a life that had shifted on its axis without making a sound. And she thought about how the biggest changes she had ever lived through had always been quiet. Nothing like she expected. Better in ways she hadn't known to look for. She opened the ledger to a fresh page. She wrote the date at the top. She started working. Henderson came by that evening with his wife, and McAllister came with his son, and somehow the Fowler brothers materialized the way they always did, without announcement, as if they'd simply decided this was where they belonged tonight. Someone produced a bottle of something that wasn't terrible. William shook hands with every man in the room and accepted their thanks with the uncomfortable grace of a person who isn't used to being thanked. He kept glancing at Margaret across the room. She kept noticing. Mrs. Henderson sat beside her at this table and said quietly with the directness of a woman who had earned it, "You saved these ranches. You know that." "The law saved these ranches," Margaret said. "The law had been sitting on its hands until you handed it something to hold," Mrs. Henderson said. "Don't minimize what you did." Margaret looked at her. "I'm not minimizing," she said. "I'm being accurate." Mrs. Henderson smiled. "You really are something, Miss Ellis." "I'm working on it," Margaret said. Across the room, William laughed at something Henderson said. A real laugh, unguarded and full. And she thought about how she hadn't heard him laugh like that before tonight. And she thought about him saying, "I had forgotten what it felt like to look forward to something." And she felt something settle in her chest that was not like anything she had a name for yet. She thought she'd get one eventually. She was patient when it mattered. The party wound down around 9. People left in twos with their hats on, and their families tucked close, and the house emptied back to its usual quiet, with the ease of a room returning to its natural state. William walked the last guests out. Margaret started clearing the table. He came back in and stopped when he saw her doing it. "You don't have to," he started. "I know," she said. He picked up the other side of the table and helped her without another word. They worked side by side in the kitchen until it was clean, and then they stood for a moment in the quiet of it. The particular quiet of a day that has been enormous finally coming to rest. "I'm going to write to Clara tomorrow," she said. "Good," he said. "And I need to get the county land documentation review organized into a formal proposal. If I'm going to help the other ranchers properly, there should be a structure to it. Something the county recognizes." "You're going to create a job for yourself," he said. "I'm going to fill a need that exists," she said. "That's not the same thing." "It's exactly the same thing," he said. "And I mean that as a compliment." She looked at him. He was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. Watching her with that fond, helpless expression she was starting to understand was just his face when he wasn't working to hide anything. "Go to bed, William," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He pushed off the counter and walked toward the stairs, and at the bottom he stopped and looked back at her one more time. "Margaret," he said. "What? I'm glad you walked 2 miles in the heat with that trunk," he said. "I'm glad I opened the gate." She held his look across the length of the room. "So am I," she said. He went upstairs. She put out the lamp. She stood for a moment in the dark kitchen of a house that had been a stranger's house 27 days ago, and now felt like something she recognized from the inside out. Something shaped like hers. Something she had not been looking for and had found anyway. She thought about Gerald Holt's letter. She thought, thank you. She meant it. Not the man, never the man, but the series of events that his small cowardly decision had set into motion, the chain of consequences that had carried her to a broken-down wagon at a Montana roadside, and a gate she hadn't planned to knock on, and a man who stepped aside in his own kitchen and let her work. She was where she was supposed to be. She had known it for a while. It had just taken this long to stop being surprised by it. She went to her room. She slept deeply and without dreaming and woke before the sun. And when she came into the kitchen, William was already at the stove. The coffee was not burned. He heard her step and turned and looked at her the way he always looked at her now, completely without guarding it. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. She sat down at the table. He put a cup in front of her. She picked up her pen. They started the day. Clara Ellis arrived on a Wednesday 3 weeks after Margaret sent the letter. She came on the afternoon stage with 2 large trunks, a hatbox, and the expression of a woman who had been worrying for 2 months and intended to assess the situation personally before she stopped. She was 2 years younger than Margaret, smaller in frame, but no quieter in opinion, with sharp eyes that moved quickly, and a mouth that had never learned the particular skill of saying less than she meant. Margaret met her at the stage stop in Harlan Creek. Clara stepped down, looked at her sister for a long moment, and then said, "You look different." "I'm fine, Clara." "I didn't say you weren't fine. I said you look different." Clara tilted her head. "You look settled." "I am settled." "In Montana." Clara said it the way someone says the name of a place they've been skeptical of since the beginning. "In a cowboy's ranch house." "In my home," Margaret said. Clara went very still. Then she picked up her hatbox and said, "All right, show me." The ride back to the ranch was 20 minutes of Clara asking questions that were really observations dressed up as questions, and Margaret answering them with the patience of a woman who had spent a lifetime being the older sister and knew exactly which battles to pick. Tommy Briggs was driving the wagon, which meant that by the time they reached the ranch gate, Clara had also received a complete account of the Whitmore situation. Hearing the deputies and William Carter's character, as assessed by a 16-year-old boy who had decided he was personally invested in how this story ended. "He sounds like a good man," Clara said as the wagon pulled up. "He is," Margaret said. "You sound certain." "I am certain." "Maggie." Clara said it quietly, the way she said things that mattered. "I spent 2 months reading your telegrams and trying to figure out whether you were all right. And every single one of them was about the ranch and the land case and the other ranchers, and I kept reading them looking for the part where you told me how you were, and it was never there." Margaret looked at her. "I'm better than I've been in years," she said. "That's the honest answer." Clara studied her face for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Okay. I believe you." Clara squared her shoulders. "Now introduce me to this man who makes coffee that isn't burned." William was on the porch when they pulled up, and he did what William Carter always did when something important was happening. He came forward without being called, took Clara's heavier trunk without asking, and said, "Miss Ellis, welcome to the ranch," with the plain, unperformed courtesy that Margaret had come to understand was simply who he was, not something he put on for visitors. Clara looked at him. She looked at Margaret. She looked back at him. "You have a very well-organized kitchen," she said. "I can tell from here." William glanced at Margaret. "That would be your sister's work," he said. "I know," Clara said. "That's how I can tell." She went inside. William and Margaret stood on the porch for a moment, listening to the sounds of Clara moving through the house with the determined efficiency of a woman conducting an inspection. "She's not what I expected," William said quietly. "She's exactly what I expected," Margaret said. "She's just faster about it." Inside, Clara opened every cupboard, examined the reorganized ledger system with visible appreciation, looked at the small room that had been Margaret's for the first week before she'd moved to the larger room at the back, and sat down at the kitchen table with the settled finality of someone who had completed her assessment and reached her verdict. "All right," she said when William brought coffee. "Tell me about the Land Commission hearing in Helena." They talked for 2 hours. Clara asked precise questions and listened to the answers with the focused attention that Margaret had always privately considered her sister's best quality. She asked about Pratt's testimony, about Consolidated Western Development's exposure, about the other ranchers' claims about the county documentation review structure Margaret had proposed. She asked about Judge Alderman, who had quietly recused himself from all Carter-related matters the morning after the deputies arrived and had not to anyone's knowledge spoken to Charles Whitmore since. Whitmore himself was in Helena in a situation that his pleasant face could not smile its way out of. "The territorial hearing is set for 6 weeks from now," Margaret said. "Sutton will represent the ranchers' collective claim. Pratt's testimony covers the systematic nature of the fraud. The individual property cases are strong because we have documentation that predates the altered records." "You're going to win," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "We're going to win," Margaret said. Clara looked at William. "And after that?" "After that," William said, "the Eastern Quarter stays where it belongs. The ranch keeps running. And I've spoken to Henderson about establishing a formal land documentation office for the county. Somewhere ranchers can go to have their records reviewed properly, with someone who knows what she's doing." Clara looked at her sister. Margaret kept her eyes on her coffee cup. "Someone who knows what she's doing," Clara repeated slowly. "There's a need," Margaret said. "I've identified it. I have the skills for it. It makes sense. Maggie." "Clara, you're staying." "I told you I was staying." "You told me you were considering it. There's a difference." Clara set her cup down. "You're staying. You've already decided. You decided before you wrote to me." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. Clara looked at William again. He looked back at her with the steady patience of a man who understands he is being evaluated and has decided the evaluation is fair. "She works too hard," Clara said to him. "I know," he said. "She won't stop working even when she should rest. I know that too. She has opinions about everything. I find that useful," he said. Clara considered him for a long moment. "Good," she said finally. "That's the right answer." Something shifted in the room, not dramatically, but completely, the way ice shifts on a river in early spring. Clara picked up her cup. William refilled it without being asked. Margaret looked at both of them and felt something enormous and quiet move through her that she was not going to name in a kitchen on a Wednesday afternoon. Clara stayed for 10 days. In those 10 days, she reorganized the pantry in a way that Margaret admitted was actually better, rode out to see the Eastern Quarter with William, and came back saying it was the finest piece of land she'd seen since she'd arrived in the territory, argued with Margaret about the county documentation office structure in a way that improved the structure significantly, and made friends with Tommy Briggs, who she described as the most useful young man she'd ever encountered, and whose mother she intended to compliment in person. On her last evening, she and Margaret sat on the porch after dinner, while William was in the barn, and Clara said without preamble, "He looks at you the way a man looks at something he was afraid he'd lost before he understood it was his." Margaret said nothing. "Maggie." "I heard you." "When is he going to ask?" "When he's ready." "Men like that," Clara started. "Clara." Margaret said it gently. "I know. I'm not worried." Clara looked at her for a long moment. "You really aren't." "No. A month ago you were kneeling in the dirt outside a stranger's gate." "I know where I was," Margaret said. "And now you're—" "I'm here," Margaret said. "That's all. I'm here." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she reached over and took Margaret's hand and held it the way sisters hold hands when words have run out of road. "I'm coming back in the spring," she said. "I know you are," Margaret said. "I might stay longer." I was counting on it. Clara left on Thursday. Margaret watched the stage until it was out of sight, and then she walked back to the ranch and went to work, and the particular ache of goodbye that she'd been managing all morning settled into something softer and more manageable as the day went on. Because this was not the kind of goodbye that meant loss. It was the kind that meant soon. She was learning the difference. The Helena hearing was 6 weeks away when William asked her. He didn't plan it. She was certain of that because she had spent enough time studying the architecture of how he did things to know the difference between his planned and unplanned moments. And this was unplanned. It had the quality of something that had been building pressure for weeks and finally simply arrived. They were in the north pasture. She had been checking fence posts, a habit now, part of her weekly routine, and he had come out to help, and they had been working side by side for an hour, in the comfortable silence they'd built together, the kind where neither person needs to fill it when he stopped. She looked up. Howe was standing with a fence post in his hands, and he was looking at her with the expression she had never found a name for, the one that was not assessment, and not gratitude, and not dependence, but something that lived past all of those. "Margaret," he said. She straightened. "I said I'd ask when I was ready," he said. She waited. "I've been ready for a while," he said. "I've been working up to this for weeks, and I don't have a speech because every time I tried to write one in my head, it came out wrong." He set the fence post down. "I know who you are. I knew by the end of the first week, and I've been more certain every day since. You are the most capable, most honest, most infuriating, most remarkable person I have ever known in my life." He paused. "I would like to know you for the rest of it." She looked at him. "That's not a question," she said. "Margaret, you said you were going to ask." Something moved across his face, exasperation and fondness, so thoroughly mixed she couldn't separate them. He reached into his shirt pocket and held out a ring, simple gold with a small stone that caught the light, and he went down on one knee in the Montana dirt without any ceremony whatsoever, and said, "Will you marry me?" Still not technically a question, but she decided to let that go. "Yes," she said. "Get up, you're going to get your trousers dirty." He stood up. He took her hand. He put the ring on her finger, and his hands were completely steady, which she found unreasonably moving, and she looked at the ring for a moment, and then looked at him. "Where did you get this?" she said. "Had it made in Great Falls," he said. "When I went to find Cole Marsh." She stared at him. "You had it made the day you rode to get the package dispatched," she said, "when we didn't even know if we were going to save the ranch." "I knew," he said. "You knew." "I knew the ranch was going to be fine," he said. "I had you working on it." A pause. "I also knew I was going to ask you eventually, and I wanted to be ready." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she laughed, the real laugh, the unguarded one, and he watched her with that helplessly fond expression, and she thought about a man riding 30 miles through the night with a documentation package under his arm and a ring in his shirt pocket, and she thought that was possibly the most William Carter thing that had ever happened. "You are something," she said. "I've been told," he said. She looked at the ring again. "I have conditions," she said. "I remember," he said. "County documentation office. And Clara visits whenever she wants." "Already agreed. And I keep my own name professionally. Ellis for the office work. Carter for everything else," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, quiet and certain, and without any need for her to confirm it, that made her feel more seen than she had ever felt in her life. "Carter for everything else," she agreed. He was still holding her hand. She looked at their joined hands for a moment, at the ring at the pasture, and the fence posts, and the land that had been his father's, and would be his children's. "I thought I was coming west to start again," she said. "I thought starting again meant becoming something new." "Did it?" he said. "No," she said. "It meant becoming more of what I already was, in a place that had room for it." He looked at her steadily. "This place has room," he said. "I know," she said. "I checked." They walked back to the ranch together in the late afternoon, and the land was wide around them, and the sky was the particular Montana blue that still surprised her, sometimes even now, and she thought about the woman who had knelt in the dust outside a stranger's gate, with Gerald Holt's 4-sentence letter in her fist, and she felt for that woman, felt her exhaustion and her grief, and her stubborn, unbreakable refusal to be less than she was, and she sent her something across the weeks. You were right to keep going. You were right to pick up the trunk. You were right to walk the 2 miles. The Helena hearing came. They went together. Margaret, William Henderson, McAllister, the Fowler brothers, and 6 other ranchers, whose documentation Margaret had reviewed and organized over the preceding weeks. They filled 2 wagons. Tommy Briggs somehow appeared in the second one, having convinced his father that Helena was educationally significant, which Margaret suspected was true in ways his father hadn't fully considered. Sutton was already there when they arrived, with Pratt's testimony organized and a legal filing that was as clean and thorough as anything Margaret had ever seen. She told him so. He said he'd learned from her telegram communications. She said that was generous. He said it was accurate. The hearing lasted 2 days. Pratt testified for 4 hours on the first day. He was not a dramatic witness. He was careful and specific, and spoke in the flat, methodical tone of a man who has made peace with what he's saying because the alternative is worse. He named names. He produced documents. He walked the commission through 18 months of systematic manipulation of territorial land records on behalf of Consolidated Western Development and Arthur Graves. The commission asked Margaret to testify on the second day. She had not expected that. Sutton had, apparently. She sat in front of the commission and answered every question directly and without decoration. She explained how she had found the acknowledgement letter. She explained the credential discrepancy. She explained the flagging system and how Pratt's removal of the Carter registration had been designed to create a vulnerability that could be exploited years later when the land became valuable. She laid it out the way she laid everything out, in the order that made it impossible to misunderstand. When she finished, the lead commissioner looked at her over his glasses and said, "Miss Ellis, you are not an attorney." "No, sir," she said. "Have you considered becoming one?" She paused. "I've considered it," she said. She hadn't, but she did on the ride home. The commission ruled in favor of the ranchers on every count. Consolidated Western Development's land acquisition scheme was referred to the territorial prosecutor. Arthur Graves was placed under investigation. 3 land commission officials were suspended pending a full review of their records. Judge Alderman resigned his position the morning after the ruling was announced. Charles Whitmore left Helena, and to Tommy Briggs's expressed disappointment, did not pass back through Harlan Creek. The Carter Eastern Quarter was formally registered in William Carter's name. The registration date read 1871, retroactive, honoring the original filing that had been stolen from the record. Margaret held the official document in both hands when it arrived. She read the date. She thought about William's father, who had filed that paperwork and spent 8 years believing his work was secured. She thought about William, who had inherited a ranch and a legacy, and a gap in the documentation he hadn't known was there. She thought about the particular injustice of a system that had been designed to exploit the gap between what people had built and what they could prove. She thought not anymore. She set the document in the front of the ledger she'd made for the new County Land Documentation Office, the first item in the first file of the first proper land record system Teton County had ever had. William stood beside her when she did it. "That's the beginning," she said. "Of the office," he said. "Of a lot of things," she said. They married in September. The ceremony was in the yard of the Carter Ranch because Margaret had no interest in a church full of people who had spent the spring reconsidering their opinions of her, and William had no interest in anything she didn't want. Henderson stood with William. Clara stood with Margaret, having returned from Philadelphia 2 weeks early because she said she wasn't going to let a telegram tell her about her sister's wedding. Tommy Briggs cried, which he denied for years afterward. Ellen Marsh did not attend. She sent a gift, a good one, a practical one, which Margaret thought was the most honest thing the woman had ever done, and a note that said simply, "I misjudged you. I am sorry." Margaret wrote back a genuine response because she was the kind of person who believed in genuine responses, even when they weren't required. The years that followed were not easy years. They were not meant to be. The frontier did not become gentle because two people loved each other, and the land did not become forgiving because it had been legally secured, and there were droughts and losses and arguments that lasted longer than they should have, and repairs that cost more than they had, and seasons when everything that could go wrong did go wrong in the particular sequence that tests whether what you've built is real. It was real. The County Land Documentation Office became something the territory noticed. By the third year, Margaret was consulting on cases in 3 counties. By the 5th, she had trained 2 assistants and was corresponding regularly with a legal reform group in Helena about standardizing frontier land registration procedures across the territory. Sutton came to Montana twice. He brought legal texts. She sent him back with annotated notes in the margins that he said were better than the books. Clara moved to Montana in the spring of the 2nd year. She said it was temporary. It wasn't. The ranch grew. Not recklessly, methodically, the way Margaret did everything with careful assessment of what the land could sustain, and what the market would bear, and what William's body could manage through a Montana winter. They added to the herd when it made sense. They hired 2 hands when the work required it. They built a 2nd room onto the house when Clara moved in, and then a 3rd room when it became necessary, which was a fact that arrived the following winter, and made William go very quiet in the kitchen for about 10 minutes before he looked at Margaret with that expression, the helpless, open, unguarded one, and said something she would keep private for the rest of her life. The morning. Margaret walked into the Harlan Creek General Store 4 years after her arrival and found Ellen Marsh behind the counter and 3 younger women asking about a land dispute that involved their family's homestead claims, and Ellen Marsh said to them without hesitation, "You need to speak with Mrs. Carter at the documentation office." Margaret paused in the doorway and felt something move through her that was too complex for a single word and too right for more than one breath. She stopped at the counter. "I'll be at the office until 4, she told the women. "Come find me this afternoon and bring every piece of paper your families have." She looked at Ellen Marsh. Ellen Marsh met her eyes directly. "Thank you, Ellen," Margaret said. "Don't thank me," Ellen said with the gruff brevity of a woman who has learned something she didn't expect to learn. "Just help them." "That's what I do," Margaret said. She walked out. She walked down the main street of Harlan Creek on a Thursday morning in October, past the general store, and the church and the saloon, past the stage stop where she had stood 3 years ago with her trunk and her bag and a 4-sentence letter in her fist, and she felt the ground under her feet. The way you feel something that has always been there, but that you finally stopped being surprised by. This was her town, not because it had welcomed her. It hadn't. Not at first, not most of it. But because she had stayed and worked and refused to be smaller than she was, and the town had adjusted around her, the way towns eventually adjust around people who refused to be moved. She passed the gate of the documentation office, a small building that had been a storage room 18 months ago and was now improbably the most organized property in the county, and she unlocked it and went in and sat at her desk. She pulled out the first file. She picked up her pen. She started the day. That evening, William came to meet her at the office the way he did most evenings, because it was on the way from the north pasture to the road home, and because he had developed the habit of walking the last mile with her. And neither of them had ever discussed this fact directly. They had simply done it until it was the shape of their days. He came in and stood in the doorway, and she looked up from the file she was finishing. "Ready," he said. "2 more minutes," she said. He sat in the chair across from her desk, the visitor's chair, the one for ranchers who came with their papers and their worries, and he waited with the patience that was simply part of who he was. And she finished her notes and closed the file and stood up and put on her coat. He held the door. They walked out together onto the main street of Harlan Creek in the October evening that had gone gold and cool, and she tucked her hand into the crook of his arm, the way she did now without thinking, and they walked toward home. She thought about Gerald Holt's 4-sentence letter. She thought, thank you. She still meant it. She would always mean it. Not for what he'd done. She had no gratitude for cruelty and no romance for rejection. But for the chain of consequences that had carried her to a broken wagon on a Montana road, and a gate she hadn't planned to knock on, and a man who'd opened it without being asked, and had never not once made her feel like she needed to be less than she was. That was the thing. That was the whole of it. She had spent 25 years in rooms that were built for smaller versions of her. She had learned to compress to manage to present only the parts that fit. She had been practical about it because she was practical about everything, and she had told herself it was enough because enough was what she had. And then a man had opened a gate and stepped back and let her walk through and never once asked her to shrink. That was not a small thing. That was the whole of it. William Carter, who had spent years building walls of silence around a loneliness he'd decided was permanent, who had opened a gate for a stranger because he couldn't walk away from exhaustion and refused to pretend otherwise, that man had become the person she planned around. The person she calibrated her life against, the person whose coffee she noticed the person across from her desk. The person beside her in every season. This land had thrown at them the person walking next to her right now on a Thursday evening in October with his arm steady under her hand. She tightened her hand on his arm. He looked at her. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Just checking." "Checking what?" "That you're real," she said. He looked at her with that expression, the one she'd finally named quietly to herself, in the way you name things that are too important to name out loud until you're certain. It was the expression of a man who had found something he hadn't known he was looking for and had decided every single morning since to choose it again. "I'm real," he said. "I know," she said. They walked home. The woman everyone had rejected became the woman who changed everything, not because she was rescued, not because she was saved, not because a man had seen her worth and granted it to her like a gift, but because she had always known her own worth, had carried it through every room that tried to diminish it, had walked 2 miles in the Montana sun with a trunk that was too heavy and a dignity that was not, and had refused with every step to put down the thing that mattered most. And the man who opened the gate had been smart enough to recognize what was walking through it. That was the love. That was all of it. Not perfect people finding each other. 2 wounded, stubborn, capable people choosing each other, clearly, deliberately, every single day, and building something the world had told both of them they weren't entitled to have. They had it anyway. They kept it. That was always going to be enough. That was always going to